So Chapter 8 is about participation and teams. The first thing that I want to say about participation in teams is that, in terms of being politically correct, participation is always going to be something that you want to foster and encourage in your organization. However, as we've kind of discussed previously, you have to take a critical view of whether participation necessarily makes sense in the given circumstances. And when we talked about models like normative decision model, it's not necessarily going to be the case that participation always makes sense, even though it's something we would almost always like to have. So I refer you back to that model and the situations in which the model tells you participation is indicated or not indicated. Here on this slide, the basic point is that there are some organizations out there that are very traditionally run, where there's very little employee participation, and leaders are controlling everything and basically doing everything as far as strategy goes. And then there are other organizations at the opposite end of the spectrum where employee participation is everything. This came, by the way, from Japan. Japan was a pioneer as a country and a culture within a country, a work culture within a country, a pioneer in team-based management and team-based leadership. We took lessons from Japan, and it became kind of more stylish and de rigueur here in the United States to have teams in organizations, whereas before, say, the 1980s, we really were not a participation-based we did not have participation-based work environments. We were not a participation-based economy here, and we took cues from Japan, who was using participation to great benefit. And you can just track the success of the Japanese economy before they had their big recession, and a lot of that is attributed to teamwork and participation by employees. So anyway, there's a continuum of participation. Think about the organization you're with and where it falls along that continuum. But of course, it's hard to know until you've been in different places where you necessarily stand. You have to have a reference point. This slide details the criteria that a leader should think about when using participation. That is to say, under what circumstances does participation make the most sense? And again, I reiterate, we have a model, normative decision model, that speaks to that very issue, but I'm going to repeat some of the concepts here because now we're talking about this again. Number one, complex task and the quality of the decision is important. So, if it's a really trivial kind of decision, like, do we paint it blue or red, and, really any decision will do, you don't need participation. It's a waste of time to solicit it. And so, be thinking about, does the decision really require input from a team? The more complex a decision or a project, the more voices and minds you want to have speaking up and working on it respectively. So participation is helpful typically for a more complex kind of a thing. If you need followers' commitment, the way you get it is you involve them in the process of the decision making. So therefore, you would almost have to be, in many work cultures, asking your employees rather to participate if you believe that it is a culture that would need them to sign off on the decision in order for them to have commitment to the decision. Again, not all cultures operate that way. Think about, again, high power distance cultures where subordinates just do what their bosses tell them, and they don't need to be asked and or told and guided and consulted before a decision is made. They just implement whatever the leader wants. The question is, are you operating in that culture? Here in the United States, it's very infrequent that you are. Time. Time is a big factor. If you're short on time, then you don't have time for participation either. So it's just not going to work. When you have the luxury of time, it's more conducive to bringing groups together, having discussions, debates, resolutions, etc. The leader and follower have to be ready. Some leaders are just not good at engaging participants. We already talked about followers and cultures where followers don't want to participate. They just want to do and implement something somebody else gave them. So there's got to be that readiness on both sides. And then finally, if there's no means of interacting, which nowadays there's very few excuses for that. Even resource-poor organizations can find ways to interact pretty efficiently. But whether you want to do it in person or technology-wise, internet, Skype, phone, conferences, whatever, there's very few excuses other than people are just too busy to interact nowadays. But that's really why it doesn't happen, is because people just find reasons not to interact because they don't like what's going on in their organization. They don't like the leadership. They don't like the ideas. They don't like what they think they're going to be asked to do or what they're already asked to do. So that's typically why you see it happen. But anyway, if you're not having that interaction potential, then forget about having participation, because logistically it's not possible. What are some of the benefits of participation by employees and subordinates? Probably the key one that envelops a lot of others here is the first one you're seeing, which is development of followers. Development, empowerment, it's pretty much the same thing. The two go hand in hand. But the point is that letting employees participate actually makes them into leaders or sustains their leadership or creates their leadership abilities, and that's typically a good thing that you want to have at your disposal in your organization. Number two, we talked about whether you have a complex when you have a complex task that necessitates typically participation and delegation to employees. Well, the idea there again was that you're going to reach a better decision because you've got more minds and voices acting on the information. From a motivational perspective, bullet point 3, followers are more motivated and they're more committed when they participate, if again you are finding yourself in a participation valuing culture. It's not a given, and you have to know what the situation is in your organization given its culture and the culture of the country in which you're operating. So these are 4 kind of major benefits. There are others that are probably smaller, but typically any other benefit you're going to think about will fall into one of these 4 broad categories. Let's circle back again to the role of culture in determining whether participation is going to make sense within an organization. Some of these issues we've already touched on. Some are newer. So the first one, collectivist cultures. Collectivist means that everybody in the work environment is acting on behalf of the group, not themselves necessarily. So they do things considering group goals as opposed to their own individualistic kinds of goals and orientations. And so those kinds of cultures, participation is such a natural fit. Again, Japanese companies, Chinese companies, most parts of Asia you see that kind of dynamic going on in the work environment, but especially and typically Japan. High power distance, as we just mentioned a slide or two ago, is going to reduce the likelihood and success and desirability of team participation. Again, in a high power distance culture where workers don't care that the leader has much more power than they do, asking them to participate is going to be a futile endeavor because they don't want to do the thinking. They just want to be told what to do. It's not going to surprise you that humane orientation, of course, supports the use of teams. Humane orientation, again, is kind of like the Carl Rogerian idea of unconditional support of your colleagues. You stay with them through thick and thin. You support them no matter what, whether they're having trouble or whether they're doing well. Of course, when they're doing well, you don't need to support them at all usually. I shouldn't say at all. There are some times, success can bring some problems too, right? But anyway, the point is, humane orientation likes teams better. It really wants to spread the wealth as far as soliciting input and getting more people rather than less involved in decision making and the outcome that's going to affect those people. Here we have a slide on the benefits of delegation. Let's first distinguish between delegation and participation. Are they the same thing or are they different? Essentially, they're very similar. That's the bottom line. Delegation, participation, you could almost use them interchangeably. The major difference is that delegation is when a leader hands a task off to a subordinate and says, here, go and do this, run with this. That's a very specific application of participation. where you're just giving ownership to your subordinates. Participation is more varied. It can be doing exactly what I just described, which is delegation, or it can be consulting your colleagues, your subordinates, your followers about certain issues, acting on that information, or maybe not. But the point is you're getting people involved at some level, whether they're doing the work or just answering questions. There's a wide range of possibilities there. So delegation, we're talking again here about just giving your employees something to do that you might ordinarily do as a leader. So why is it good? What are the benefits? One, it gives you more time to work on higher level strategic issues. That's the holy grail for any leader. You want to spend time thinking about how to move the organization forward strategically. And you can, if you're not fighting fires all the time, you can have more time to do that. And that ultimately is what the strategic leader should be doing. That's why they're the strategic leader, the CEO, the CFO, the president, the whoever. Number two, you're giving your employees development opportunities. We talked about that before. Usually they want these things. They want the challenge. Most employees who want to advance in the organization want a challenge. So if you're giving them work through delegation, then they're going to get that challenge, which summarizes their bullet point 3. 4 is one you might not have thought about, allowing observation and evaluation of employees in new tests. How are you ever going to know how good they are until you see them doing the work that you yourself used to do? Okay. Now, some leaders won't delegate because of fear of delegation. We're going to get into that in, I think, the next slide or two. So for every reason I'm giving you here, you could think probably about a leader who's saying, well, no, I'm not really comfortable with doing that, even though there's benefits. Okay. But again, if you're doing it right and you're doing it the way you should, you're creating opportunities to observe your employees and evaluate them in a wider variety of tasks to see just how useful they are to the organization in things other than the ones that they normally do. And then last but not least, we mentioned this quickly before, is that employees who are motivated by delegation and owning the tasks will be more motivated and more satisfied when you actually do delegate to them. This slide talks about how to do good delegation, a set of guidelines that I think are pretty powerful, and some of which are often overlooked when leaders delegate. So definitely take this slide to heart because it's a really good general guideline as to how to delegate properly. Number 1, you have to give your subordinates a mix of pleasant and unpleasant tasks. Your book talks about the concept of dumping. I like that term because it sounds like one of those things that's a nasty thing to do to people, and in fact it is. And it's when a leader just gives the subordinate all the nasty hard tasks that don't create any visibility, that make the subordinates stress out, that they find themselves sinking rather than swimming. So what you want to do is be fair about your allocation of pleasant and unpleasant tasks. It's not that you can't delegate an unpleasant task. It's just that you have to be fair about how much unpleasantness you're sending to your subordinates' way when you make these decisions about who's going to do what. So be appropriate and delegate a balance of the good stuff and the bad stuff across all of your subordinates that you feel are worthy of being delegated to. Number 2, you have to clarify goals and expectations. Sounds obvious and almost would be axiomatic that you would have to do that, but when you give out a task, you have to really spend time training people not only on the methods but also on what you want. Which typically means that you have to do a lot of spot checking once the behaviors are starting to be put in place. That is to say, you delegate, the employees work on the task that you delegated to them, and then you have to really closely monitor the results and see if they are following along the right path. So we kind of skip down there to the second to last bullet point because the two go hand in hand. If you've got good clarified goals and good follow-up monitoring, then you're going to be a much more effective delegator. Point 3, delegate authority along with responsibility. What the heck does that mean? Well, basically, you have to tell people that you're delegating. Tell the employees that need to know about the delegation that these tasks have been delegated to that person. Whether you do it face-to-face in group meetings or over email or whatever your communication mechanism is, it needs to be said that a certain person or a team is now responsible for this particular thing so that they know who the go-to person is, who's got the authority to make the decision, Because a lot of times what will happen is if you don't communicate that, or don't communicate it properly enough, then there's a break in the chain of command, or confusion in the chain of command, and that confusion slows things down because people don't know who the right decision maker is, or they question the validity of the person or team who now claims to be the decision maker, who preside over the issue. Okay, so make sure that you communicate broadly to whoever needs to know that there has been delegation. Providing support kind of goes along with the training that I mentioned before. To the extent that it's needed, you have to provide it. And then we talked about monitoring, providing feedback, and lastly, the last issue is an in-group, out-group thing. You really should be, in accordance with what we talked about, the leader membership exchange model. You should be delegating to different followers, not just picking the ones that you like the best and the ones that you always think will do a great job, which is a very safe strategy, obviously, and a lot of leaders would like to use that strategy, but what winds up happening is you don't develop everybody. You just develop a select group of people, and so the good ones stay good, and the bad ones never get any better because you're not spreading the wealth of the development opportunities. So think about, again, how to include everybody in the delegation if you can. This is probably my favorite slide in the whole course, a bunch of excuses for why leaders don't delegate. And I'm guilty of doing some of these myself. You probably are as well. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's just something to acknowledge and maybe to think about improving within yourselves. I sure know that I need to, again, sit down and think about how to do some of these things better, because this happens to me all the time where I'm just perpetually afraid to delegate things. So let's kind of go through the reasons. My followers aren't ready. They're not capable. That's probably the 1 and 2 are kind of go together. They're not ready. They're not capable. They don't have the right skills. That's the number one excuse that I use. I just think I can do it better. So why would I give it to my followers to do when I can do it better? Well, the reason is you can't do everything, right? You're going to be stretched too thin as a leader, and you need to be working on a whole host of other issues other than things that are too low level for your level of leadership if you're a strategic leader. So you have to find ways to delegate and get the skills to the people that you're delegating to, so that you can focus on other higher level strategic issues. 3, I kind of already mentioned, not comfortable delegating my tasks because I think they'll do better. I'll do better rather, or I think they're going to screw it up majorly, because they just don't know what they're doing. They're not as good as I or somebody else, and I have to use them. So that's another excuse you see. I can do the job quicker myself. Yeah, said that already. My followers are too busy. So sometimes the same logic applies to your followers. They got too much to do, so I don't want to delegate them any more tasks because they're already busy and they're already very good. And I know that they can be delegated to, but I'm going to overload them with too much work. And so that's something you just have to assess honestly and say, look, do they really have too much work, or can they absorb some more? And just make sure you're not using an inaccurate excuse or an inaccurate assessment of their workload as an excuse to not give them more work when they could just very readily accept it. I'm responsible for followers' mistakes. Sure, if they make a mistake, ultimately the chain of command ends with you as the leader, and so therefore that's a reason not to delegate. The healthier attitude to have is, well, I know they're going to make mistakes. How do I minimize the chance they're going to make mistakes? And let's invest in our followers for the long term, which necessarily means we're going to have to tolerate some level of mistakes, or what I call mistaking. It's a verb that I created to describe the process of learning from your mistakes. Okay, it's just inevitable. The point is, are you set up to catch people when they fall, and to save the organization when it falters because of these mistakes? Okay, so that just comes down to good planning and good systems and processes to catch people who are not following the rules or not doing things right when you delegate. Last one's interesting. My own manager may think I'm not working hard enough, right? So if I'm giving away too much work, then it looks like I am just taking the easy way out, and I'm taking a vacation. So that's a real concern. And again, it comes down to what should the strategic leader be working on. If you're really giving away too much work, the question I would have is, again, what's the nature of the work that you're giving away, and then where are you spending your time after you give it away? If you're giving away a lot of work so you can free up your time to work on higher level strategic issues, I would say that's a good decision. And also, you can always dive back into the work if you feel like you need to kind of set the example and be a role model. So it's kind of like, I remember when George Bush went out to visit the troops in Afghanistan, he would show up at the army base there and serve the army folks some dinner. Now, he's not doing that every day of his life. He can't afford to be over there all the time when he was president. But he can do a little bit of the work as a symbolic gesture, and also just kind of to be a role model and set an example that he's not any higher or better than anybody else, and he can get his hands dirty. So, you can frequently jump back into the work to set an example, to show people the right way to do it, to be inspirational, and still delegate at the same time by a process that I kind of think of as like a work sampling. So think about that. So now we discuss characteristics of teams, and these are to be distinguished from groups, which are less organized and less, I would use the word committed, than teams are going to be by definition. So, the team is kind of the elite form of the group, and that's how we distinguish between teams and groups. And team also has a little bit more of a permanent connotation to it, even though the team doesn't necessarily have to be a permanent entity. So let's talk about some of the principles that teams ideally would operate under. And again, this is an idealistic viewpoint, not necessarily the actual way teams always operate. One, there are common goals amongst all team members, so that there is consensus around what it is that we're trying to accomplish, how we're going to accomplish it, and minimal dissent on goals. Not necessarily minimal dissent on methods and preferences and work styles. Okay, and that's typically a problem with teams, is they don't come to a consensus on those things. Mutually accountable to each other. So a team is really a self-managed entity, and so while it might report out to somebody else or to another team, really the major reporting flows are going to be within the team, where one team member is reporting to another and vice versa. So that's the accountability aspect. You can't have a good, well-functioning team without trust. I think that's kind of a basic, almost goes without saying kind of a principle. What happens in a low-trust team environment is nobody really wants to do work for anybody else. Nobody wants to contribute to the team's output because everybody feels like they're going to get cheated by their team members. And so everybody's always trying to minimize their efforts. So there's a whole social psychology field of research that deals with how team members can maximize or minimize their outputs, given the fact that they're now in a team. So we'll get into some of that later in the course, probably. Collaborative culture, we're working together. That kind of goes along with the trust and the accountability. And the leadership is shared. You'll see some teams, not all teams, but some teams will actually rotate team leaders and say, okay, you've been leader for a month, now we're going to make it somebody else. Or maybe there is no one distinct hierarchical leader. Everybody leads or owns their own functional contribution to the team. But at the end of the day, whatever mechanism is being used, it's going to be a sharing of the leadership. All of these things should then lead to synergy, which means that the team is producing better outcomes than each of the members would produce by themselves. So the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, so to speak. And that's exactly the concept of synergy, which if a team is functioning well and doing all the things that we say here, you're going to get a better outcome than the members would be able to produce on their own working as individuals. So this slide touches on an issue that we discussed briefly in the last slide, the idea of self-managed teams. The basic idea here is that the team really doesn't report to anybody. and is able to make and implement its own decisions. This is not a very common thing that you see in practice, I will say. It's a newish idea, the idea that you have a team that doesn't report to anybody. It actually was in use at a company that I used to work for, Procter & Gamble. And even when you had teams that seemed like they were always self-managed, meaning never reporting to anybody and never consulting anybody else about decision making, sooner or later you would have to do that. So I am very leery of this concept personally, based on what I've seen. Everything in life is always a matter of degree and extent, and so the question is, to what extent is the team self-managed, with the understanding that at some level every team is accountable to somebody or something or some body. Okay. But the basic idea is to not have to utilize resources when outside resources when all the resources are present within the team. Okay. So therefore, your third bullet point: no outside manager, and you're making and implementing all your decisions. And of course, you have to interface with other teams to get your work done. So right there's typically some kind of an accountability relationship. But the point is, again, to what extent is the team not managed or managed lightly by an outside entity, meaning somebody higher than them in the hierarchy, or some other body within the organization that's going to be responsible for leadership. A concept similar to self-managed teams is self-leadership, where each individual serves as both their own leader and their own follower. Again, very idealistic, something that you want to strive for, but something that you just don't always see 100% in reality. You'll see varying degrees of this, and it's basically a good concept because, again, like self-managed teams, it tends to minimize the amount of resources, that is leadership and managerial resources, that people and teams draw on. And also is more efficient. Again, every time you have to ask the leader for help, consultation, direction, nurturing, whatever the item is, that's time and energy and resources spent on that particular occurrence versus, hey, I can do it as my own leader, and I can do it without involving other people and utilizing those resources. So some personal guidance about how you do self-leadership here on this slide, like motivating thoughts, staying positive. You've heard that probably about 1 million times in your life. Setting your own goals, monitoring your own actions, and again, there's really 2 ways to think about that. You can, as a leader, give people ways to monitor their own self-actions, or you can let the subordinate be his or her own leader and then therefore derive his or her own kinds of monitoring processes. Obviously, there are trade-offs to the 2 methods. It depends on how much you trust your subordinate and whether they've come through for you in the past as to how you're going to make your decision on that issue. But the whole idea is that you really involve yourself in leadership as opposed to somebody else in all aspects of what a leader would do. So there are things that leaders can do to help followers develop their own self-leadership potential, which, again, just to reiterate, it tends to be, if it's done right, more productive and more efficient. So a major theme you're going to see emerge here is the idea of independent thinking. Okay, so really what you want to do is get your subordinate to be, as we've said before, empowered. Part of empowerment is driving the thought processes down to the lower levels, so to speak, of the hierarchy. And so doing things like asking questions rather than giving direct answers, sharing information, encouraging independent thinking. These things kind of all go together towards that end goal. Okay? So for instance, a subordinate may come to you and say, yeah, I'm not sure how to solve this problem. Can you help me? And instead of saying, well, you need to do X, Y, and Z to solve this problem, or go talk to this person and they'll help you out, try to guide them down a path where they're being asked questions that kind of hint at what they should be thinking about. Well, how do you think you should be solving this problem? What kinds of problems have you had like this in the past? What have you seen others do to solve problems like this? So you can start, again, kind of just teasing your subordinates, for lack of a better word. You're teasing them into asking themselves appropriate questions pretty soon without your help as to how to go ahead and figure out the solution to whatever problem that they might be facing that given time. So, really independent thinking, getting them to be creative, and there's a whole body of knowledge on how you foster creativity. So, you might want to read up on that. There's a lot there, but there are certain conditions that foster creativity, things like low-stress environments, things like giving people more time, etc. You want to drive that instead of making them conformists. What are some of the roles that team leaders take on nowadays? What you're going to notice here are two major themes. One is that the team leader is more than just a person who tells you how to run things. It's a person who tends to be more of a consultant nowadays. That's one of the major themes here. Giving advice, not being so dictatorial. We've talked about those kinds of leadership styles before, autocracies. That's one theme. So things like helping to manage conflict in relationships and assessing skills and helping define goals and tasks. That's more of a consultative style of leadership that a team leader is likely to take on nowadays, as are things like helping the team clarify boundaries and counseling and encouraging team members. Let me talk about the boundaries piece there, because I think that's probably the most interesting one that you might not think about. What do we mean by boundaries? Well, it's basically telling the team what it should and shouldn't do. What kind of work should it accept? What kind of work should it reject? How hard should it work on something? Because there's typically going to be a lot of balance issues in a team that's interacting with the rest of the organization or other teams in the organization, and the leader needs to clearly define or help the team define what its specific responsibilities are versus what responsibilities fall to others. And not that it's always such an easy thing to do, and not that it will always be universally acceptable to others within the organization, but the team leader does at least make an attempt to do a good job with that. The other thing I want to point your way is, or point your attention to, is the continue to make individual contribution oval there. The team leader is contributing in all the ways you're seeing here, but then they should also be setting an example of doing the work themselves. And a good team leader will take on a modest chunk of work, but not too much, because then they really can't act in their capacity as being the team leader as well as they could if they didn't take on so much of the actual work. So team leaders need to balance doing the work to set the role model example, and then also contribute individually by doing some of the work, which gets the work done and, of course, reinforces the idea of being an effective role model. Some of the typical dysfunctional behavior you see in teams is summarized nicely, I think, here. Let's deal with each piece separately. Groupthink is when everybody thinks the same way because they want to, as a team, minimize dissent and just get the job done. People just, they want to go home and not think about work all day. They want to solve problems. They're getting paid to solve problems, and so when they come together in groups, because they don't want to upset anybody and they don't want to prolong arguments, they tend to eventually start to think the same way and then voice their opinions in the same way. And dissent is discouraged or sometimes not tolerated at all, depending on how much groupthink there is. Also, groups tend to make more risky decisions because of what I just mentioned. They will not consider all the facts they need to consider, because once there seems to be some healthy level of consensus around an issue, the group wants to basically get closure on that issue and move on. And so that dissent that is ignored tends to lead to groups taking riskier decisions than if people were considering the issues by themselves. There's also a cushion effect. People think, well, because I'm part of a group and we're all making a decision, how can 40,000 or sometimes 4 Frenchmen be wrong, as the saying goes? If we're all thinking alike, we can't be wrong. And plus, we have a support network within ourselves. So therefore, groupthink can be very dangerous, and it happens so often that you should almost assume it's going to happen just about every time. Free riders, people who do this thing called social loafing, which is a term that describes the minimization of work that people do when they join groups, because they always figure somebody else will do it for them. And there's all these studies that have proven this, but we see it all the time in groups and organizations, and you should, again, expect it to happen. Certain people will free ride more than others, and one of your goals as a leader is to minimize that from everybody. If you can eliminate it, even better, but that's hard to do. There's always going to be some element of free riding. If it gets really, really bad, you will hear from your subordinates that somebody is free riding. In other words, not pulling their weight, not doing their share of work, in which case then it becomes a management issue for you as a leader. Negativity. There will be bad apples. There will be some people on a team that just criticize everything the team does, and this is not healthy criticism or constructive criticism. This goes beyond that mode of operation into something much more dangerous and destructive. Okay, where the person is just kind of being working at cross purposes with the organization and with the team. And so one of your jobs as a leader is to root out those kinds of people, or at least get them to change their outlook and their expression, because negativity has a way of bringing the whole team down. If there's just too much of it out there, it's too frequent, and you get too many adherents to the negativity through this contagious effect, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Nothing gets done or done right because everybody is trying to fulfill the negative stereotype here. So you have to be on the lookout for that. Not that everything has to be 100% positive and we have to show up to work glowing every day and thinking everything we do is great, because you're going to have problems. That's a given. The question is, what do you do when you have those problems? How negative do you get? Or do you reserve some of your negativity for the right time? There is a time and a place for being negative. It's just that it's got to be done strategically, and it's got to be done constructively, which is really not negativity. It's another thing called constructive criticism. Lack of cooperation and trust. Again, we touched on this before. If team members don't trust each other, the work's not going to get done right or done at all, and it's going to be a suboptimal output for obvious reasons. So here I think you have probably the most interesting slide in the chapter. It talks about groupthink, what causes it, what it looks like, and what the consequences are. So let's deal with each piece in turn here. What causes it, or put another way, what are the antecedents of groupthink? Some of these are obvious, other these are not as obvious. So high cohesion, of course. If you have people working well together, like each other, that's going to be ripe for groupthink because nobody wants to upset anybody else. Not as obvious is complex situation. Complex situation, because your subordinates are facing a complex task, they want to try to minimize the mental strain that they're under to solve the problem. And so therefore complexity tends to lead to higher levels of groupthink. This has been shown conclusively in the research. And again, it's a reaction to or trying to minimize the complexity by coming up with a simpler solution, which means that you have less debate and less dissent and less reconsideration of alternatives. Directive leaders. Remember, there's two kinds of leaders in the world. Directive leaders and nurturing leaders. Directive leaders tell you do X, Y, and Z specifically, whereas nurturing leaders are just more about encouragement and emotional support. Consideration, as we've called it. So strong directive leaders tend to lead to more groupthink because you're not giving your subordinates or your teams chances to think about the issues themselves. You're saying, hey, do it this way, think about it this way, and therefore that's what the team does. So that's going to lead to more groupthink. Insulation from outside. If the group or the team or the leader doesn't have to report to anybody else, or they're self-managed. By the way, that's part of the problem with the self-managed team, is that you can get a lot of groupthink going on in the self-managed team. So self-managed teams not always such a great idea, especially when it comes to the groupthink potential that they can get into. But what's happening there is an insulation effect, meaning nobody's reporting to them or they're not reporting to anybody else. And so therefore the team thinks that it's kind of invincible and invulnerable and doesn't have to answer to anybody. Lack of procedures. Consider alternatives. Some teams just don't know how to think about decisions. And so they just take the one that's easiest and the one that's most obvious without delving deeper into the information and the alternatives and speaking to other experts who might be able to help them. And so therefore that's going to lead to groupthink. That is groupthink, essentially. Now, how do you know when you're seeing groupthink? All the things you see to the top right here. The team seems like it's invulnerable. Belief in the morality of the group. We think we're doing it right. We know we're doing it right. You're going to hear these kinds of words. It's the only solution. We believe in it so much. These are things that are nice to hear, but if you hear too much of it too often, you start to wonder whether there isn't a groupthink phenomenon going on. Collective rationalization, which means the group comes up with some weird way to justify their decisions that doesn't make any sense, but since everybody's saying the same thing, there's comfort in conformity, right? Stereotyping outsiders. So I've seen this happen firsthand, where anybody who disagrees with the group that's outside the group gets criticized and gets labeled as somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. Okay, even though, again, this outsider or outside body may have some very good information and may have the missing link that the team needs to consider to make a better decision. These people or these bodies tend to get stereotyped and demeaned, and so you see that going on. I would probably think there's a groupthink phenomenon going on in that kind of team. Self-censorship. People censor their own thoughts. This is something that you have to ask people. Do you tend to not say what you want to say because you think it'll upset too many people? Okay, if that's happening, there's groupthink going on there. But again, that's something you have to tap into with each individual on the team or in the group. Illusion of unanimity. I think that's kind of obvious. Everybody seems to think that there's unanimous decisions being made. Direct pressure on dissenters. Yeah. So anybody who does dare dissent is basically told to shut up. Maybe not so forcefully, but in no uncertain terms. They're quieted down, and dissent doesn't have to be, again, loud. It can be very subtle. It can be very polite. It can be very diplomatic. Something along the lines of, well, we think the team is progressing nicely, and this idea is a good one, but I think it's going to slow things down if we stop and think about it. Right there, that's kind of an indirect pressure on a dissenter. Just to use one kind of dialogue as an example. It may not take that form, but you see how polite that was and how diplomatic it was, yet it's still pressure on dissent. Self-appointed mind guards, so people just kind of do the pressure thing on the dissenters. And they appoint themselves without having the team say, okay, you're the one responsible for calling us out on anything that doesn't make any sense. So the consequences, I won't really go through them here because I think most of them are pretty straightforward. But, all across the board, groupthink just basically doesn't work in the long run. You just wind up making faulty decisions because you don't really internalize the risk that you're taking, and you don't really think about how to come up with the best decision and implement the best decision when you are in a groupthink environment. Just 2 slides to go here in Chapter 8. This slide is about building trust, and I just want to touch on the issue of rewarding cooperation, which is one of your bullet points here, or ovals, so to speak. There's things you can do like having open communication, being fair, being equitable, which can happen a lot of different ways, having integrity. But the rewarding cooperation, I think, is much more specific and says, look, if you have things like bonuses or public appreciation or praise available at your disposal as a leader, then use that to say, hey, you know what, people cooperated and therefore should be rewarded for that cooperation. Really, no matter what kind of environment you operate in, rewards almost always tend to work as long as they're the right kind for the organization, and of course are within budget. And sometimes it's not even a budget issue anyway if we're talking about things like praise or recognition. So you have to think about, how am I going to not only foster it but reward it, because the rewarding it actually fosters the trust. Rewarding trust fosters trust. The other ones here I think make sense. Being honest and having integrity as a team, respecting each other, which comes out of a lot of these other items like doing good work, working hard, being competent. Can't have trust if people are incompetent and others see the incompetence filtering throughout the team. Open communication. We have to be good communicators so that all the facts are before us and we know what everybody's thinking and doing and why they're doing it, etc. So these kinds of elements are ones that build trust. The last slide deals with training activities for teams. How do teams get better at working as teams? And so there are things like team building exercises, kind of, to go to the woods and fall into somebody's arms. You've seen those things. You've probably done some of them. You've probably seen them mocked on TV. They've had some commercials making fun of those a while back. The point is, there are all sorts of team building activities. I've not seen any research on whether they really work, so I don't know. It would be an interesting research project to take up, whether going into the woods and falling into a group's arms from a tree really builds trust within the office. I tend to think not, but again, I don't have any definitive results. Cross-training, teaching people to do more than one thing. There is some debate on whether that makes sense. If you talk to economists, they tend to think cross-training is not an effective use of resources, at least in the macroeconomic sense, because economists believe in specialization. Get better at what you're doing by only doing that. But it's something to consider because, again, when you have idle capacity, what do? You let it work on something else. So people who aren't 100% at capacity can find work to do, and it makes the workforce more efficient as far as making sure they're occupied. Your book talks about the other three. I'm not going to go into them now. Just give them a quick read in the textbook. And congratulations on being done with Chapter 8. We'll see you next time.